All right, Trevor. So we were in the middle of talking about a repossession or a collection agency. Um, we talked about the prohibition of going to Hilchos, but if you have a clear promissory note that just is lacking collection and there's no ambiguity about the fact that the guy owes you the money, then you're not required to go to a beis din in order to get a judgment. He says, "Amnam legabe ha'isr shel halicha le'erkos shalav nemar shehu meirim yad b'toras Moshe Rabbeinu," right? Where anyone who goes to a secular court is lifting up a hand against the law, the Torah of Moshe, like we learned before, the importance of going to a beis din. He says, "Nira she'ein kan." He says that doesn't exist here. Kevin shehem lo danim al hachov v'lo oskem b'shum birur ovadati. He says they're not deliberating. The court is not deliberating over the debt. They're not dealing with any kind of clarification of who owes whom money. It's already quite clear that the money is owed, and it's just that the fellow is a deadbeat, right? And he hasn't been paying. Rak mivatzeim et hagevia. All the court is doing is enforcing the collection. Mikol makom misha'ar ha'isurim yesh bazeh baya. But there are the other problems that we detailed, which is that you're not allowed to invade a person's private home in order to collect his stuff. V'lachein b'chol davar legufo shel inyan ki pa'amim. He says, so to get down to the bottom line, I guess he's saying, ki pa'amim sheyesh heter lifnot lahotzah lefo al kagon kishahachavot novim lo machmat halva'a. He says there are times when you would be permitted to repossess a person's property if the debt is not a product of a loan. Ela kagon mimechira schora. He says, let's say merchandise was sold. Velo hayakan zekef alav b'milveh v'chayotze bazeh. And the what was due was not set up as a loan. It's just a question of the guy hasn't paid. In other words, he owed, let's say, one lump sum. It's not that we put him on a layaway plan where now he's in debt to the company and we extended him credit, but rather we told him, take the merchandise and you don't pay until January, let's say. So in that situation, if it's just payment is due January 1st, and then he just defaults, there could be situations where it would be permitted even to go into his home and repossess the appliance. But he says, "Aval kaven sheyesh bedavar harbe pratim, sarich lifnot lebeitin levakesh heter miyuchad." He says, but since there are many details of when you can and when you cannot invade a person's property in order to repossess things that they own, you really cannot do this unless you first turn to the beis din and find out what your rights are as far as being a repossessor. And therefore, anytime there's any kind of doubt whether or not a person will pay back his debt, it's always good to get a guarantor, an arev, right? A guarantor. And this way, you don't have to be concerned. Get some kind of security, whether it's an object that you hold for security, which is a pikadon, or get an arev, get a cosigner. He says, when it comes to a guarantor, the halacha is different. What does he mean to say by that? So if you look in the footnote, he says, "Kamoshenifsak b'shulchan aruch b'zelishano." When do we say that it's usher for me to go into a person's home and take his items? If I'm a creditor, that's only when a person himself is the debtor. In other words, the person himself has borrowed money, and you know, and he doesn't have, he's not paying me back. So then the Torah prohibits me from going into his home and taking his items. But But if a person acts as a guarantor on a loan and the loan has not been paid, guess what? All of the protections that are laid out by the Torah for a debtor are not provided for a guarantor, which is fascinating. A guarantor has less right. I don't know what the law is in Canada, but a guarantor has less rights, according to Shulchan Aruch, as far as being protected than the debtor himself. Ela imkain hu ariv kablan sha'azdino kalova. Unless he's an ariv kablan. Now, this term ariv kablan means that he has been designated as the first point of collection. So there's two types of arevs. There's a regular arev, and then there's an arev kablan. An arev kablan is a person who so heavily guarantees the debt that the arrangement in the contract is that when the debt is due, I don't even have to go to the lova, I don't have to go to the debtor to ask him for payment. The fact that I have not received payment gives me the right to immediately go to the guarantor. Whereas I skip the whole process of asking the lova, where's the money? Okay, so in that situation, he reverts back to the status of a debtor, the guarantor, because he's so much filling the shoes of the original debtor that he becomes like the debtor himself. But if he's just a guarantor, which means I have to first go to the debtor, and I have to say, where's the money? And I have to sort of send him a notice that the debt is due, and he refuses payment and so forth. So then I have a right to go to his guarantor. And in that situation, I would even be allowed to invade his private space, provided that it's permitted according to Dina de Malchusa, in order to be able to get his stuff. V'chein mi sheyesh lo schar etzel chaveiro, bein schar atzmo, bein schar behemto, o kelavo schar beso, mutar l'mashchano shelo al pi beis din. Here's another example where you're allowed to invade someone's space in order to collect a debt. Let's say someone owes you payment, not as a loan, but as compensation, whether it's compensation for rent or compensation for work, or whether he rented an item from you and owes you payment for, let's say, the use of your car or the use of some other appliance that he rented from you. So he says, "V'likanes lebeisa lemashchana." Then you have a right, according to halacha, even to go into his home and take his goods. Again, provided that it's not grand larceny. In other words, you can't go into someone's home if the law doesn't permit you to do that. But the restrictions that are placed by the Torah on a person collecting is specifically on a debt. But v'imzaka v'alav haschar b'halva aser ad kamoshana. But that's only if payment is due for work that has not been converted into a debt. If it's been converted into a debt where the guy says, "Please extend me time to pay you," and you say, "Okay, I'll give you 30 days to pay me," so then that now becomes like a loan. The Rama adds over there in the Shulchan Aruch that to take someone's eating utensils, the things that he needs for basic essentials, a bed, eating utensils, and so forth, those are not things that you're allowed to take, even if a person is an arev or he owes you rent, because those things are the bare essentials of what he needs. But do you have a right to go into his home and take his television, take his computer, etc.? That you do have a right until he actually pays you. But it's complicated. In other words, I wouldn't rely on this without getting a psak in your specific cases. Well, the Torah says that if you're going to be taking someone's pajamas as collateral, and you know it's his only pair of pajamas, then you have to let him give it to you during the day, and you have to return it to him at night. So, but that doesn't really have very practical applications today. But anyway, so I don't know how we would apply this. This may not be as a practical of a halacha because lema'aseh, practically speaking, no no court is going to give a private citizen the rights to take someone's stuff. But what if a person owes me money? I guess I would have a right to go to court, have the court enforce the collection, garnish his wages, as you spoke about, and so forth and so on. Um, could the sheriff potentially have to get involved? Sure, sheriff could potentially get involved, but that's all part of Dina de Malchusa. And as long as, yeah, right, as long as it's not a private company that's doing that, I suppose. I'm not sure how we would translate that as far as when the government gets involved. I think once you pass it over to the government, and if the government has to get involved, I guess they do. The question would become: would you be permitted to ask the court to send the sheriff to the guy's home in order to collect his stuff? Um, and I suppose at some point this might be acceptable because of Dina de Malchusa, although that's the part that I'm not 100% sure. Um, that is that is correct. You're never allowed to go into someone's house. Now, that's only when it's alone. What if a guy stole from me? What if a guy literally came to my house, picked up a Fabergé egg that was on my mantelpiece, and took it into his home? Okay, um, I would be permitted to. I believe we learned this together at some point in the Imrei Yaakov. I would be permitted to take the law into my own hands and go into his house as long as I'm not breaking and entering. Let's say he opens the door and lets me in, I can walk in and just take the Fabergé egg back. All right. Okay. This is a follow-up. This next question is
let's say you let somebody a book, and then never mind, why and you let's say go over there for Shabbos or whatever, so you see that book, and you just take it, or you have to ask permission to take that book back, even though it's your book.
that's a good question. That's also not a question. That's not a halva. That's not a loan. That's the guy borrowed something from you. That's a she'ela. And it seems like the prohibition of not going into someone's house and taking his items is only when it comes back to payment of debt. Here, it's your item, and he's borrowed something from you, and he's never returned it. It would seem that it's okay. You should probably notify him. Hey, you've got my book. It's got my name in it. I'm going to be taking it with me. And if he protests and says, "Yeah, but I still need to reference that book," you say, "Well, look, I'm sorry, but it is my book." I can't imagine that in most situations anyone's going to object to you taking what's yours. Okay, Siman Chavav. לגשת להוצאה לפועל באופן שברור שיש לו בכסף וממאן לשלם. Again, a follow-up question, really asking the same question, utilizing a collection agency when it is clear that the debtor has money, but he's just refusing to pay. So I lent my friend money, and he doesn't want to pay me back. It's clear to me that he has money. He's taken his family out to the restaurant, and he's going on vacations, and so forth and so on, but he just doesn't want to pay me back. Ha'im mutarli lageshet la'hotzah lefa'ol bichdei sheyigbu es chovi. Am I allowed to refer to a collection agency for them to collect what's owed me? Ki ein li shum optzia acheret legabot et chovi. I have no other option. That's an interesting word, optzia, right? It's a modern Hebrew word from the word option. Efsharut, I guess, would be the correct Hebrew word. But I guess they use this. She'ein kivin she'ein lo v'shum nechasim michutz lebeito she'otam haya efshar legabot. He says the debtor doesn't have any other property outside of his home that I can go and collect on. So all of his assets are in his home. How do I go about collecting what is owed to me when it's clear that he has assets? Okay, so tshuva, the answer is, in other words, he's done a pretty good job of hiding everything that he owns, and the only things that are obvious that he has are in his home. So he says, Nemar b'Torah ki tashe b'reacha masha'at mu'uma lo tavo el beito la'avot avoto. So he starts off by again quoting the pasuk that when you are owed money by your friend, you shall not come into his house to take his item, to take his security. Bachutz ta'amod v'ha'ish asher atano shabo. You must stand outside, and the man that you are seeking to collect from, Yotzi elecha et ha'avot hachutza, shall produce the security outside. He shall bring the item of collateral outside to you. V'lachein adam shehilva lechavero kesef v'hu lo machzir lo et ha'halva'a. And therefore, when a person lends his friend money and he doesn't return the loan, asur lokachat mimenu mashkon v'lo liikanes lebeso. You're not allowed to confiscate any object of his, nor are you allowed to go into his house. It is not only forbidden for the creditor himself to do that, to go into his house or to check out what he has in his house. Even a proxy of the court of a beis din does not have a right to do that. The only thing that he does have, the shliach of the beis din has a right to do, is to take things that are outside of his house, like his car. Shemasha HaTorah Amra Bachutz Tamod Zechozer al Shliach Beis Din Shemutalo Lamashkein Es Halova Michutz LeBeis. Because the right to stand outside and to take whatever he has outside of his house not only falls upon the creditor himself, but also upon the proxy of the beis din. Amnam, Kasev HaTorah B'Shem HaRabah, V'chol Masha HaTorah Asra Al Shliach Beis Din Milhikanes L'Soch Beis Halo V'Lamashchan Al Haynu Davka Im Yeshna Efsharut L'Bal Chov L'Hipara Mimenu Be'ezet Surah Shehi. He says the Torah actually writes, quoting the Ramah, that when the Torah prohibits the appointee of the beis din to go into his house to take his items, that's only when there's another option for the creditor to get paid back. Kagon sheyesh lo karkaot o metaltalim michutz lebeito. So, for example, if the debtor owns property or chattel outside of his house, then the shliach beis din cannot go into his house. He has to only take those items that are outside of his private home. Avalim ein lo shum davar michutz lebeiso shebo yuchal lifroach chovo. But let's say the guy does not have. In other words, so going to the bank account, garnishing his wages, getting a court order, that's all perfectly fine. The only prohibition is to go into his private space where he lives to take his stuff. But if there is no other option, the guy does not have any bank accounts that we can find. He's hidden all of his assets. And the only way to get anything from him is because he's got this amazing baseball card collection or whatever he's got. And the Lova says, I don't have any other assets with which to pay. But the creditor says, "Oh, the guy's got a ton of assets, but they're all hidden in his house. He's got artwork, and he's got collections, and he's got all of this stuff, and he even keeps his cash in his safe or under his mattress or whatever. In other words, he's done a really good job of sort of hiding everything. And even if the Malva does not know that for certain, but he suspects as such, mutter l'shliach beisdin lehikanes lebeso shel halova v'lakacha lo chafatzim shemutar lemashkenotam. Then it would be permitted for the shliach of beisdin, for the beisdin's appointee, sort of like the bailiff or the sheriff, to go into the guy's house and to confiscate those items that are not bare essential living items. Aval siyam harama sham shehalacha lemaisa ulo ratza lahorot bazeh kivin shezelo muzkar b'talmud. But the Rama says, but since this halacha is not mentioned in the Talmud, and it only is based on logic that we have to figure out some way for the creditor to get his money back, Ela im kain yadua shahalova ashir, we can only resort to this if we know for a fact that the lova, the debtor, is wealthy, the lo rotze l'shalem, and he just refuses to pay back. Da'az mutar l'shliach beisin lehikanes lebeso. Then and only then do we give permission to the proxy of the beistin, not the creditor himself, but the beistin's proxy, to actually go into his home. Ki acheret kol echad yifchad lahalvos kesef v'yesh kan neilas delas b'fnei loven. He says, because if we are too liberal in this law, in other words, we have to, I think what we mean to say is like this: we have to make an accommodation for a creditor to get his money back, because if we don't, no one's going to lend money. So we have to make sure that we have a way of if when we know for a fact that the debtor has money, but that he's hiding it in his house, we have to be able to get in there and get his money back. Because of od hatur sham shekein ze kasav harif b'tshuva she'im halova hu adam alim v'ra me'alalim u'meiz panav lo rotza lifro achovo. So the Tur also quotes the Rif, who says in a responsum that if the debtor is an aggressive personality, is just of very poor moral character, he's impudent, chutzpahdik, and just simply refuses to pay back the debt that everyone knows that he owes, mutter lihikanes lebeso ladas matspuna v'alfiyo al yedei shliach goy. You would be allowed to go into his home to see what he has, even if you do so via a non-Jew. In other words, there are circumstances when this would be okay. But again, you can't, it doesn't seem like you're allowed to take the law into your own hands. You would first have to consult with the Beis Din. V'chein kasav habach she'im eidim me'idim sheyesh lo v'mamon o shehu ba'atzma model hazeh. He says the Bach also writes that if there are witnesses who can attest that the debtor has assets, and or rather, we have heard that him tell people that he has a lot of wealth. But he says that I'm never paying back that guy the money because he didn't give me a kibbut at his son's bar mitzvah, right? So I'm never paying him back, right? I thought he was my best friend, but I'm never paying him back, which of course is ridiculous, right? You owe money, whether the guy's your friend or your enemy, you owe him the money. Akol modim shemutali kanes lebeso lamashchano the priyas balchov mitzvah adkan devara. Then in that situation, we would agree that it would be permitted to enter into his house and to forcibly confiscate his items, because in that situation, it's a mitzvah to pay back a debt. Now, of course, that has parameters, right? V'chein kasuv b'gemara b'ksuvis dekiven de priyas balchov mitzvah maken oso l'shalem ad shetetzei nafsho. The Gemara has a very dramatic statement. It says that if a person clearly owes money and he clearly has the wherewithal to pay, but he just is just an action and he refuses to do so, just like with any other mitzvah. Like, what do we do to a guy who's recalcitrant husband and refuses to give his wife a get? We whack him until he says, okay, I want to give my wife a get. Well, the same thing is true. If it's clear as day that the guy owes the money, in the good old days when the Beis Din had more authority, we would take him to the Beis Din, we would tie him to a chair, and we would can be very convincing yeah, that he owes the money. So that's the Gemara actually says, that you strike him even to the point of where he dies if he still refuses to pay. We can't do that anymore. And like they say, don't try this at home. V'chein pasak harambam mir shehuchzag ramai udrachav mikulkolim b'maso v'matana. That if a person is already established, and by the way, this exists today, there are people who are established swindlers. I'm dealing with someone right now who's being swindled by a swindler. And the worst kind of swindler is a guy who takes advantage of someone's wife because he's a smooth talker, right? And that's what I'm dealing with now. Okay, udrachav mikul kolim, and he's corrupt in all of his business dealings. V'hu amid sheyesh lo mamon, and he is a man of means. He has money. He goes around town driving a Maserati. The toin she'en lo klum, and he claims that he has nothing. Yesh koach biyad Beis Din lechafoso va'afilu lenadoso, that Beis Din has the permission or the authority to coerce him and to put him under a ban ad sheyashalem, until he pays. Kaven deprius balchov mitzvah, since it is an absolute obligation to pay back your debts. So, based on that, when it is the only resort possible to invade his home, this is almost sort of like a footnote to the previous tshuva, or sort of like an asterisk. If we've tried all other options, and the guy clearly has wealth, and he's not, there's no other place where we can collect it, then we do have a right to send a sheriff into his home and collect the items. Okay. Then he says, "V'yesh lahosif otzad heter b'davar zeh lefi ma shekasav ha'imrei bina." He says there's one other reason that we can justify going into a person's home and sending a repossession agency. The im halove yesh lo l'shalim v'lo rotza l'shalim. He says if a person has the wherewithal to pay back a debt and just doesn't want to pay it, yesh kan umdana demuchach dal da ze lo hilva lo hamalve v'yesh kan halva b'tos. He says then we can assume that if the lender had known that the debtor would refuse to pay back the loan, he never would have lent him the money in the first place. And the guy is therefore, this was never a loan, but rather theft. And therefore, retroactively, the guy is a gazlan. As I mentioned before, when a guy steals something from you, you're allowed to go into his house and just take it back. Okay, I want to look at that a little bit more tomorrow. We'll continue this tshuva, Mirza Hashem, tomorrow, and then let's see what's the next in Hachzer Tashlum of Nasiya. That's okay. We'll take a look at it tomorrow. Okay.